We have a ton of wonderful folks for you to meet today and excited for the adventure. We'd like to come to some collective agreements about how we're going to show up together today and for the rest of our time. And we'd like to ask these 5 agreements of you, if you will agree with us, to show up and actively listen. So really be thinking as you're hearing and not just let things pass. We ask you to be authentic in everything you share and to believe that everything is being shared with you is authentic. We ask you to take ownership for only your role in whatever work that it is that we are talking about, whatever has happened in the past, whatever is happening in the present, whatever is ever happening in the future. That is all you can be responsible for. And we'd like for you to allow for a little discomfort. These are heavy topics, and so you might feel a little uncomfortable, and that is okay. It's okay to sit with that. And then lastly, we would like for you to help us co-create a safe space for everyone to be able to share openly, to be authentic, and to take ownership. So I'm going to turn it over to Celilia now, who's going to share a little bit more about Ecosystems Unite.
So Ecosystems Unite actually it came about as some of us met together in San Antonio for what would have been, unbeknownst to us, one of the last in-person convenings. And we were hearing about news about the pandemic and thinking about all the ramifications and impact that it would have on economies and our communities in particular. So as we prepared to depart, we realize as ecosystem builders, we understand ecosystems to be nodal. So they're just different parts of the community doing things in their custom and bespoke ways. But information is really best cultivated and shared in a hub and spoke model. And we also understood that it needed to live on a platform where people could openly contribute and share some of the things that they were seeing, because as a network, we're stronger together. So Ecosystems Unite was actually born as a Facebook group specific to COVID, and people from all across the world shared things that were happening in their communities. It wasn't anyone's particular domain. Everybody was open and invited to come together and share the resources. Since then, we've evolved into a Mighty Networks platform, currently shared and hosting space to share more information about events and stay connected. And we'll share that information with you. But really, it's currently just a place to meet and huddle up and convene as we need to. And as we approached this and all of the things that happened, we realized that one of the important conversations that we needed to have was about systemic racism and the effects. So I will turn it back over.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kristen Lutz, Executive Director at Startup Champions Network, and so privileged to work with Celilia and Faye on a lot of things, but especially this project. And to see you all here today feels really great. So we'll begin, we love alliteration, so we have the 3 kind of pillars of inform, inspire, and ideate. We'll begin with some information about a framework referred to as IDEATE that helps give us a helpful framework in which to have and hold these conversations, which are challenging, but also really exciting and important. And that will take us to about 1 o'clock. We'll go to Inspire, which is a fishbowl conversation with some really phenomenal entrepreneurial champions from the field to share their thinking. And it gives those of us in the ally category a chance to listen and absorb, which sometimes when you're in a conversation, it's hard to have that active listening. So we'll do some deep listening during the Inspire section. And then IDEATE is a chance for all of us to share not only examples of what we think is already working, but ideas about what could work to address systemic racism and issues in our entrepreneurial settings.
And with that, we'd love to share a word from Andy Stoll from the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation.
Thank you, Faye. I'd like to send you, Kristen and Celilia, some gratitude, along with the teams at Forward Cities, the Startup Champions Network, and Ecosystems Unite for hosting this space today for this important and essential discussion on how we address racism and inequalities in entrepreneurship to build more vibrant and equitable communities. As we all suffer through this pandemic, and we continue to see more and more episodes of racial injustice caught on camera, we must focus, I believe, on both short-term and long-term solutions. True inclusion and equity, though, will only come from rethinking the systems and the structures we have in place that fuel our current economy. America's founding promise of equity for all has not been fully realized. I know I don't have to tell any of you that. But the generations that have come before us have made progress. But still, historical, structural, and legal barriers have created today's systems, and it's up to us to do our part to build back better systems in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. In my own experience, I spent more than 5 years working on building the entrepreneurial ecosystem in eastern Iowa to help the region recover from the massive 2008 floods, which at the time were the fourth worst natural disaster in US history. What I learned is that in every crisis, there is opportunity. This has almost become a cliche in 2020, but I assure you that it's true. What I saw firsthand is that when a community experiences a crisis, new models, new approaches, new leaders often step in and take hold. When everything breaks, communities must often muster the courage and the will to do things differently. 2008 spelled that opportunity for the Iowans I worked with. 2020 makes systems change more possible in more places, but it's certainly not a guarantee. Change takes leadership, and that comes from people like you. You are the leaders you have been waiting for. Mr. Kaufman, who started the Kaufman Foundation, was born poor in rural Missouri, borrowed $5,000 to start a company in his basement in Kansas City, and later sold that company for multiple billions of dollars. Later in life, when he was asked why he could be so successful, he said it was because he got a great education and the opportunity to become an entrepreneur. So at the Kaufman Foundation, we focus our energies on education and the civic infrastructure in Kansas City and entrepreneurship nationally. The foundation is often most known for its entrepreneurial research. And what we've learned in 25 years of entrepreneurial research is that entrepreneurs matter. Entrepreneurs change lives of both individuals and their families and have significant impacts on their communities in many ways. But we also must make sure that the entrepreneurial playing field is level, that everyone, regardless of who they are, where they come from, has a shot at their entrepreneurial dreams. Mr. Kaufman believed that to be true, and it's core to our work at the Kaufman Foundation today. And I know you're here because you believe that to be true too. Now, entrepreneurs survive and thrive within ecosystems, and how we build, support, and sustain these ecosystems really matters. Ecosystems require leaders stepping up, taking a look around, considering the whole system, and making sure it's accessible, inclusive, and welcoming to everyone. These types of inclusive and equitable ecosystems can be built anywhere, but cannot become a reality until we recognize and address the systems of oppression that have been baked into our current economies. There are no easy answers or a ready-made playbook on how to do this. That's why I'm excited that we're here and the Kaufman Foundation is able to sponsor this event, and that you've joined us today for these conversations. The only way we're going to figure this out is to figure it out together. I'm excited to join you today, and I'm thankful for your willingness to step up and lead. I want to close with the words of Mr. Kaufman, who famously said, "All the money in the world cannot solve problems unless we work together. But if we work together, there is no problem in the world that can stop us as we seek to develop people to their highest potential." I look forward to working alongside you today and in the coming months and years. Thank you for participating in today's event. Back to you, Faye.
Always fabulous to have Andy to be able to be with us. He understands this work on such a deep level and cares passionately. So grateful for the Kaufman Foundation support in this effort. Okay, I'll turn it over to Celilia.
So in introducing our next speaker, we realized that, as Andy mentioned, growth happens at the end of your comfort zone. So when we invite you to lean in to the discomfort, we think about journeying through information around cultural competency and diversity and inclusion as a journey. None of us have all the answers, and we only look at things through our own lens. So I wanted to introduce Anika Horn, who's the founder of Social Ventures. She has been an eloquent voice in ecosystem building. And like everything else, as we embark on this journey and we suffer through the peaks and the valleys and experience new things, there's a struggle and an awareness that we gain by sharing different perspectives. And Anika has been a great champion of sharing diverse perspectives from all over the world. So here to share some of her personal experiences is Anika.
Great, Cecilia, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for showing up for this important conversation. My name is Anika Horn. As Cecilia alluded to, I have had the chance to talk to a lot of entrepreneurial ecosystem builders from all around the world over the last 18 months through a platform that I founded called Social Venturers, where I'm on a mission to create and curate insights, resources, and a peer community for entrepreneurial ecosystem builders who believe in the power of entrepreneurship to help local communities thrive. And as part of that, I had the great honor to interview Faye, interview Kristen, and really dive really deep into some of the questions around entrepreneurial ecosystem building. I will say that when I started out on this project, I considered allyship, diversity, equity, and inclusion a building block of the work that we're doing. The last 6 to 8 months have taught me that it's not just a building block, but it is the very foundation of being a good entrepreneurial ecosystem builder. And that's what I want to share with you over the next 10 minutes or so. Before we dive in, there are 3 things that I want to lay the foundation with. Number 1, Black people are not one homogeneous group, and the experience of Black entrepreneurs is not universal. I will be referring to Black entrepreneurs as a collective, but I'm fully aware that that's really more for the sake of argument and in the sake of time. So please be aware when I talk about it that I'm mindful of that difference. Number 2, we all have implicit bias. Like it or not, we're all biased. Thanks evolution, it made us this way. I myself am biased in many ways that I found out over the last few months. So in the spirit of how we want to show up today, it's okay to be uncomfortable and accept the fact that we all have some sort of bias. And lastly, I am not here to be right. I'm here to get it right. And I encourage everybody else to follow me in that approach. As many people of my skin color, I'm still somewhat new to this conversation. 2020 has been really eye-opening for me, and I am constantly trying to learn. That means I will make mistakes, I will get it wrong, and I give myself some grace for it, and I hope that everybody else can do the same for each other and for themselves. All right, talking about allyship and anti-racism and entrepreneurial ecosystems. This has 2 dimensions for me. Number 1, it is a personal issue. I don't care which side of the political party you're on. If you are a racist, I think you have work to do. This is not political. I think if you are someone who lives in the United States and wants to support entrepreneurs, this is a deeply, deeply personal issue, and that's where the work starts. Read, learn, listen. We have never had this many easily accessible resources as we have now to get really educated. Forward Cities has a fantastic podcast talking about inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems. I've put together a resource guide. There's so much material out there that there is no excuse for anyone to say, I didn't know, or I don't really understand it. I know it's uncomfortable to learn that stuff, but that doesn't mean that's an excuse not to. I'm not going to argue with anyone about their personal preferences and their attitude towards racism, because there's a second aspect to this conversation that I think is equally important, and that is facts. And facts is something that is much harder to argue with. And I want to share with you a number of these facts just to show you how deeply entrenched racism is in the US economy and in a lot of the work that we are trying to do. 8% of VC venture capital funded startup founders are women, only 8%. 1% of VC funded startup founders are Black. 0.4% of startup founders who received VC funding are Latino. And 0.00006% of VC funded startup founders are Black women. To translate that, that is 6 women, 6 Black female entrepreneurs out of 1 million that have successfully raised VC funding. Just let that sink in for a minute. I'm talking about VC funding because those are the best numbers that I've been able to find. Please know that VC funding is by no means for every entrepreneur or for every startup. It's really about 0.5% of startups that can take advantage of that. But this trend is indicative of something that we're seeing even at the local level. So now that you see those numbers, I do also want to share with you what that means on the other side of the equation. For example, venture-backed women-owned companies perform 63% better than male-led companies, irrespective of skin color. In the US today, we have 8 million businesses that are owned by women that create an economic impact of $3 trillion every year. That translates into 23 million jobs, which represents 19% of all the jobs in the US. And if we look at Black-owned businesses, we're talking about 2.5 million firms in the US today that are owned by Black entrepreneurs, generating $150 billion in revenue each year, which is phenomenal. And not only are they the fastest growing entrepreneurial group, but they're also the most resilient, outperforming the national average of startups by the factor of 6. So for whatever reason, even though Black entrepreneurs are some of the most disadvantaged founders in this country, they have been performing off the charts and leaving their white counterparts in the dust. So I just want you to be aware of how uneven the playing field is for not only Black entrepreneurs, but also LGBTQ entrepreneurs of different ages, abilities, affiliations, socioeconomic backgrounds. So let these numbers sink in for a minute, and I'm happy to share some of these sources later on. But I do want to switch over to what that means to us as ecosystem builders. For everyone in this room who wants to support entrepreneurs, I want to remind you all that our job is to connect the dots in our local communities between the people and the resources so that they can find each other really, really quickly. The thing that we've been really bad at is taking the full entrepreneurial stack into consideration. I think many of us, and I'm guilty of that, and I'm not proud of it, is that we've been serving a particular tranche, the tranche that's been right in front of us, and connecting them as much as we can and as well as we can. But man, there are so many entrepreneurs on the sidelines who have not been on my radar, that haven't had the access to our co-working spaces, to our mentor networks, to other support organizations that we've erected and put in place. So we can in no way say that we are good ecosystem builders if we are not serving the entire diverse entrepreneurial stack in our communities. Not just because it's equally wrong, but because it is a macroeconomic impact. In other words, we're not fully leveraging, we're not optimizing the productivity in our ecosystem if we're only playing with one small tranche of entrepreneurs. And I don't know if you know this, but the more innovative the ecosystem is, or the more diverse it is, the more innovative it is, because suddenly we have very different perspectives coming together. Is it uncomfortable? Oh, absolutely. It's the worst. But having those different perspectives and having the friction is where innovation comes from. Because if we're all sitting in the room, we all look the same and talk the same and eat the same and dress the same, how are any new ideas going to come about? But if we want to invest in innovation and if we want to optimize our ecosystems, that means really broadening our perspective and bringing the entire entrepreneurial stack into the fold and doing that work. And now I would love to tell you how to do that. I'll be honest, I've only just started this journey. So I think we're here today, and hopefully in 2.5 hours, you will have an answer to the question of how to do this well. Here are a few things that I've learned over the last few months in interviewing ecosystem builders about how we can become better allies. Step number 1, start with yourself. This starts in here and in here, and for you to decide how you want to show up for underrepresented and minority entrepreneurs in your community. From there, listen and learn to what your local community needs and what under-resourced entrepreneurs in your community need. Because as you know by now, we have to grow our own ecosystems, and that means we can't just copy and paste what's working in other communities, because each community has their own set of challenges and hurdles. But even better, each community has their own set of skills and talents and gifts that we as ecosystem builders can leverage. But we can only leverage them if we know what they are and how they show up and how we can foster all of those seeds to create something much bigger and more beautiful than we could do it by ourselves. There is a term inclusivity, and I know that Faye has a lot to say about that. So if you haven't read her Medium pieces yet, I recommend you go do. But I talked to Del Gines, who's also an eloquent writer and speaker on this topic of inclusivity, and he talks about passive versus active inclusivity, and I do want to share that with you guys. Passive inclusivity is having a space and saying, hey, if they come here, we'll make them feel welcome. It's just opening up a space. We're diverse, we're inclusive. If you want to come, sure, you can come hang out, even though it is maybe a predominantly white space or a predominantly homogenous space. Active inclusivity, on the other hand, means going out, going above and beyond, and finding out what that even means. Because to be honest, even if I had a space and I invited people in, I don't know what Indigenous entrepreneurs need to thrive. I don't barely know what a Black entrepreneur might need when they come into my space and want to work with me. So the responsibility is on us to be actively inclusive. And as Faye will tell you, inclusion is not going to cut it. It's very limited because it still supposes that I hold the power to invite people in. And that is a construct that is just not true. So you may as well let go of that idea right now. So the framework that you will learn about today, IDEATE, will give us a lot more ways to think about how to be good allies for entrepreneurs in our communities. Yeah, and for now, I'm as excited as everybody else to learn about how to be a good ally and how to bring this into the local communities and into our work. And with that, I'm going to kick it back over to the organizing team. Thank you all.
Really appreciate you showing up today. I think is a perfect way for us to start our informed session. We're going to dive deeper now into our informed session. We're going to talk about IDEATE, which is a framework for anti-racism for entrepreneurial supporters developed by Forward Cities. I am very grateful to have a colleague by the name of Shayla Herndon Edmunds, who I'll tell you a little bit more about later, but she is a equity and inclusion consultant, and we co-developed the IDEATE strategy. And she's going to share a little bit more here. I always love for her to start because she does this so well, and she takes us back to some history and some past that's really important and grounds us in language.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm Shayla Herndon Edmunds. I am an equity and inclusion consultant, and I have the privilege of working with Forward Cities. So I'm here to talk about our learning objectives for the day. It's really important to us as we've come to develop this IDEATE curriculum to really make sure that we are helping people to deepen their understanding while also giving them practical insights for how they can make informed change within their work. So our objectives for today and for this work are to help you to develop a repertoire of inclusive language and practices for really engaging currently disenfranchised entrepreneurs and small business owners, as well as historically excluded entrepreneurial support organizations. We also want to help you to develop a more in-depth awareness of the history of entrepreneurship and race in our nation and its long-lasting impacts. And last, our desire is to help you to develop a readiness for engaging in more inclusive collaboration and also program development within your organizations. So helping you to move this out of the framework of the context of this conversation and also leveraging this work and this understanding in your personal work wherever you are in the ecosystem. This is important because this work is going to require all hands on deck. Essentially, we need to crack the code for how to foster a culture and economy that produces shared prosperity, because we know that trickle-down economics is not working and was not designed to work in the first place. The reality is that communities are laboratories where pathways to inclusive economies can be pioneered, but it requires intentionality and resilience and us really having an understanding of what it is that we are dealing with. And so we also know that lack of inclusive support structures are one of the many barriers that entrepreneurs of color in particular are facing, and that both historic and modern systemic racial inequalities create and uphold many of the barriers that we strive to change or that we're hearing from entrepreneurs day in and day out. So before we dig into our content, what we want to actually have you to do is move into some small groups. And when you're in your small group, I would love for you to share your name, your pronouns. So my name is Shayla Herndon Edmunds. My pronouns are she, her, hers. So share your name and your pronouns. Your given name is welcome as well. And then I want you to choose one of the terms that you see on the screen and share with your group how you were taught to understand that particular term and how, if at all, your understanding has changed over time. So the words that we invite you to choose from are race, racism, racial equity, anti-racism, inclusion, privilege, and power. Take a moment to decide which term you would like to focus on. And when you move into your breakout groups, please share your response to the question I've posed. How have you learned to understand it? How, if at all, has that understanding changed? And when we come back, I'm going to walk through quickly a definition for each of these words that we'll use to frame our conversation and learning for today, while recognizing that there may be other examples or definitions of these terms that exist. So take a moment. So welcome back. Thank you for engaging in your small group discussions. I hope that you had the opportunity to meet some people that you haven't interacted with before. And we're going to take a couple of minutes to dig into these common terms. Dr. Angelo often said that we use the same words, but we don't often talk about what we mean by them. And we don't always have the same dictionary. So having common or creating common language is important. So we'll start with race. Race is a socially constructed system of organizing or categorizing human beings that's largely based on observable physical differences, what we also know or are also called phenotypes, such as skin color or ancestry. While ethnicity refers to shared culture, such as language, practices, beliefs, customs. And it's important to note that there is no scientific basis or discernible distinction between racial categories. Research actually shows that we're about 99.5% the same, which supports the reality that race is a social construct. Racism is a complex system of racial hierarchies and inequities. And at a micro level of racism or individual level, we see it as internalized and interpersonal, meaning that we're all vulnerable to racism and its effects, and the beliefs and the attitudes that it creates. So I can internalize racism myself, and it also impacts the interpersonal relationships that we're having with each other, whether we know it or not, that we're using these lenses and that we are showing up in ways that connect to how racism exists within our society, even if we're not actively or intentionally playing a role in it. At the macro level of racism, we look beyond the individuals and we stretch to thinking about and looking at the broader dynamics, not removed from individuals because we're situated in that broader dynamic, but we think about it on the layers of institutional racism and also structural racism as well. Racial equity involves trying to understand and give people what they need in order to enjoy a full and healthy life. Equality, in contrast, aims to ensure that everyone gets the same needs in order to enjoy a full and healthy life. And like equity, equality aims to promote fairness and justice, but it can only work if everyone starts from the same place and has the same needs. And so this idea of equality being sometimes what we use as one size fits all, or, everyone has access. And what we may miss when we use that model is that everyone doesn't have access, because maybe you invited me to the event, but you are hosting the event in a place that doesn't have access to public transportation, and I can't get to it. Equity would be making sure that I can get to the event that you're giving me access to. Anti-racism is the policy or practice of opposing racism and promoting racial tolerance. Inclusion is the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded. So really having that intentionality of making sure that the outcomes for people are that they have had access, that they've been able to engage in an experience, because we recognize that without that level of intentionality, that may or may not be true. Privilege is a built-in advantage that's separate from our individual levels of income or our efforts. It's having greater access to power and resources than people of color or people with other marginalized identities who in the same situation as us. And then last here is power. Power is the possession of control, authority, influence over others, the ability to do or to act, and the capability to do or accomplish something. And power can exist both in a formal way. So there may be power that you have as a result of the positions that you hold, the title that is under your name, the acronyms that are behind your name. And then there are informal manifestations of power that may exist in things like your network, so who you know and who knows you, your popularity within the community, your visibility within the community, that may not necessarily manifest as formal, but they are definitely forms of power. And so the next definitions, and we won't unpack all of these because I've touched on equality and equity already, but intersectionality is the theory that that helps us to understand that our identities do not act independently of each other. They actually act simultaneously. And that because of that, we have both privileged and oppressed identities, or it's possible for us to have both privileged and oppressed identities. So using myself as an example, I'm an African-American woman. Those are two oppressed identities that I have and I experience every day. I don't put down being African-American and then lift up being a woman, although there may be times that one identity may be more salient than the other. For example, when I'm in the room and I'm the only woman, my identity as a woman may be a bit more salient to me, may not. But the other identities that I hold, I'm a cisgender woman and I'm a heterosexual woman. So I identify with the sex that I was assigned at birth, which is what makes me cisgender. And I'm a heterosexual and married to a man, which means that when I'm in public and I hold his hand or display any form of affection, I don't have to worry about someone shunning me or balking at my existence. And as a cisgender person, I don't have to worry about being misgendered or having people not honor my pronouns or my lived experience. So that's an example of how we can have both privileged and oppressed identities that are actually being engaged at the same time. And the entrepreneurs that you serve, the people that you work with in your organizations and in your communities have intersecting identities. And it's important that we understand that because no one is a monolith. Remember that equality is about us finding broad solutions and sometimes focusing so much on equal access to one thing that we fail to recognize that there's nuance and complexity, and that equal access may require more intentionality for us, that requires us to zoom in and figure out what the needs are in order for people to get there. So equity is essentially what we're focusing on that results in folks' outcomes not being predicated on their identities. So a Black and white entrepreneur who both have great ideas, incredible grit, incredible ability to scale and to be successful. Their race should not be a predictor of their success. Their work, their connection with their customers, their ability to scale, them knowing their business should be what is helping them to be propelled forward instead of their identities either pushing them forward or holding them back. And so I'll pause for a moment and allow you to hop into the chat and engage. And if there are thoughts or questions that come up for you as you're hearing these terms, then I would invite you to add them there. As you engage in the chat, I'm going to move us a step forward so that we can start to think about history. History helps us to understand change and how the society that we live in came to be, which is really important because having that basis is really insightful, and it helps us to understand why the disparities that we experience or observe today exist. And sometimes that's important because it challenges our assumptions about why they exist. And sometimes our assumptions are to blame those who are being marginalized and oppressed for their own oppression. Knowing more about our history interrupts that. So we go to 1518 when enslaved Africans who had their own language, their own culture, their own morals and customs, businesses and infrastructure were brought to the West Indies, enslaved and brought to the West Indies. Then by 1653, we know that the first enslaved Africans were brought to Jamestown, Virginia, and that the slave trade was formalized or began in North America. In 1776, a passage in the Declaration of Independence that called for the condemnation of slavery was removed from the passage because it was deemed controversial. And then in 1802, Ohio did something important. It outlawed slavery in its constitution. But don't get excited yet. 1803, Ohio became the first non-slaveholding state to pass black codes, which restricted African Americans from voting, testifying in court against whites, doing jury duty, joining state militia, attending public schools, and even imposed a $500 fee just to register one's certificate of freedom. So on one hand, Ohio abolished slavery, but then it turned right around and began Black codes, which we came to call Jim Crow laws. It became the first state to do that. And it's important to acknowledge it because other states followed. And so if you follow this history within the state that you grew up in, or wherever you are, or wherever you travel, you will see how this had a ripple effect throughout our country. And for example, in 1831, North Carolina enacted a statute that banned teaching slaves to read and to write. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that Jim Crow laws and practices did not conflict with the 13th and 14th Amendments, arguing separate but equal. We are oftentimes we're taught about when this particular law was overturned, but we're not taught about the context in which it was created and upheld. In 1906, Black Wall Street was formed in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, when a Black landowner purchased 40 acres of land. We still talk about Black Wall Street, and it's a point of pride within our community. However, in 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacre resulted in the killing of hundreds of people there and the destruction of that thriving community. So while we saw the increase in communities and infrastructure being built by Black folks for themselves, banks and businesses and in communities, we saw a backlash to that as well as former enslaved Africans and their descendants started to move beyond the subservient and inferior roles that had been kind of codified for them within our infrastructure. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was established and furthered its segregation efforts by refusing to insure mortgages in or near African American neighborhoods. And this policy became what we know today as redlining. Redlining still impacts us and still exists today. We have other words or other ways of describing it, whether it's rezoning and in some instances gentrification, but it still has modern day manifestations. And this is within 100 years of where we find ourselves today. And so my homework to you is to, within your own locality, dig in more into this timeline and find out how some of these milestones that I've emerged actually matter within the context that you live in and that you work in and the history of the place that you now call home. History doesn't repeat itself, systems do. And so we're going to take a moment to actually look at some of the implications or the impacts of the history that I just shared. I mentioned earlier that it's easy for us to begin with our current stats or demographics on disparities. And sometimes when we do that, what we then do is create a narrative about why the people who are experiencing the disparities have done it to themselves or how they're perpetuating it. And that ties into stereotypes and biases about Black and brown people. And so we want to challenge that by beginning with the history and then looking at the implications of it. So what we know is that the racial wealth divide has grown over the last 3 decades. We also know that COVID-19 death rates are higher for Black and Indigenous people. We know that home ownership is heavily skewed towards white Americans. And we know that the top tier for wealth is far lower for Black and Latinos than other demographic groups. And we could provide many more data points that show that from everything from healthcare disparities, where we see women of color who are dying at higher proportions or higher rates during childbirth than other demographic groups. There are countless examples of ways in which these disparities that were created over time and embedded in our systems continue to churn out inequities for members of Black and brown communities. And that brings us to today, when we think about, in the context of entrepreneurship, this idea of bias, barriers, and bureaucracy. And I'll take just a moment to share with you what we mean by that. Bias refers to the systematic deviation from rational choice theory when people choose actions and estimate probabilities. So we make assumptions that don't have basis and are not taking into account real information. For example, when given $1 for every dollar of investment that women of color or women receive in VC spaces, there's about a 73 cent return on that investment for every dollar. Our white male counterparts, for every dollar they receive, there's less than a 50-cent return on that investment. So one might say, oh, wow, the rate of investment in businesses owned by women of color should be off the charts. And that's simply not the case. Less than 2% of businesses owned by women of color are receiving VC funding. Barriers we identify as obstacles, whether emotional, cultural, financial, physical, experiential, educational, or otherwise, that really prevent or limit movement and access to entrepreneurs. So that our history can be a barrier. When I live in a city that has a history of redlining that my family has been impacted by for generations, then today the emotional trauma and even the financial impacts of that are a barrier. We are not without our histories and the timelines that precede us. Bureaucracy it reflects the processes, systems, and practices that we put in place that require many steps, oftentimes in strict order and with inflexible rules that entrepreneurs must follow in order to complete a task. So we think about things like access to funding and the need for, or even a grant during these COVID times. That I've personally seen applications for grants for $500 or $5,000 that require more information from me as an entrepreneur than I was asked to provide when applying for loans from a bank. And I didn't always, if I don't have that information in place as a startup, then that means that there may not be actual access for me to receive those benefits. Or maybe you require a business bank account for me to receive funding, and I haven't actually scaled my business or made that step yet. When there's inflexibility, there's lack of access. And so that's what we mean by bureaucracy. So take a moment and just think about each of these terms: bias, barriers, and bureaucracy. And as you see the definitions, begin to think about how you might have experienced them or witnessed them within your own ecosystem and what the impacts have been on entrepreneurs.
I appreciate Shayla sharing that with us. These are the big B's, right? These are the things that we face every day. And as you guys are entering things in chat, I just want to share really quickly to let you know that these things are not, they're not relegated to just what entrepreneurs experience. And so just to take you a little bit of my personal journey in this work, I did start off as an entrepreneur. I wanted to start a business for women, a marketing business for women. And just in trying to do that, I experienced barriers. I experienced that I was not necessarily welcome in sort of typical startup spaces. I didn't fit. I didn't have a sense of belonging, and I wasn't able to equitably participate. I faced barriers almost immediately when I just from starting. And in doing that, what I learned is that I wanted to be able to help others like me. So I wanted to figure out, how can I support people so that they don't have to go through what I'm going through? So, hey, you know what? I'm just going to solve this problem. I'm going to become a business coach. I want to help people figure this out, and dug into that work and realized that, I couldn't get the same support or funding or, sort of engagement as some of my white counterparts who were doing the same set of work. And that landscape on an entrepreneurial support level also has the same bias barriers of bureaucracy. In experiencing those things, I then decided, hey, I'm entrepreneurial. This is what I do. I got to try and fix problems, right? All right, so let me become an ecosystem builder. Let me try and connect some of these dots for people that are having these challenges and facing these barriers and getting stuck in the bureaucracy. So I started seeing how I can connect the dots for entrepreneurs of color within the ecosystem. And in doing that, it meant stepping into advocacy. And that can be a very slippery slope, because then you go from someone that is supporting in entrepreneurs, which everyone loves, to being the person that maybe has to call out, hey, maybe that's not the most equitable practice. maybe we need to be thinking in a different way. And in doing that, that becomes very, very challenging. And in the next conversation, we'll have you hear a little bit more of that. And so where I finally got into on this personal journey related to the 3 Bs is that this work is so massive and is so deep on every layer of the ecosystem that the only thing that's gonna change and create lasting change is actually we have to go backwards. We have to do some healing work related to race in our nation and race in our ecosystems. And we have to be able to start, like Shayla said, from understanding our history. So understanding the past, being willing to look at ourselves in the present, and then being able to reimagine a different future and different system. And so that's what Forward Cities has done. We're looking forward. So what is a framework for anti-racism that entrepreneurial ecosystems can lean into? And the framework we have come up with is called ABIDE as an acronym. And it starts with access. This is a 2-day training. So what I'm trying to do is boil it down today into a 5-minute sort of description of the framework. And we'll dig into a little bit later. But here's some questions that you guys can ask yourselves related to this framework. From access standpoint, is the opportunity, whatever it is, reasonably within reach for everyone? Does it resonate with a variety of cultures and lifestyles? That's the belonging piece that Anika was talking about earlier. It's not okay, it's not enough just to say, hey, everybody's welcome, come on. They have to feel like that they belong. Everyone has to feel a sense of belonging. Are multiple perspectives integrated into leadership? And that means from the board level down to the design of programming, to the implementation of programming, and the promotion of planning. Is there an intentional openness and an outreach to all? Diversity doesn't happen by accident, it has to be intentional. And then from an equity perspective, this is really important. Are there compensatory considerations to address historical and systemic oppression? And that means that from a funding perspective, from a programmatic perspective, from every perspective you can possibly think of, you have to look back and see, how can we offer more? How can we offer better? How can we double down on efforts to address that gap? And then lastly, this idea of COVID-19. This is now, you have to ask this big question that we didn't have to think about a year ago. How does the pandemic and its effects exacerbate existing biases, barriers, and bureaucracy? So basically you take all of these things and now it's times 10, because as we heard in the data, COVID-19, the pandemic, is disproportionately impacting the same group of people that already faced these issues. So just a general framework here to dive into. We're going to now take actually on this journey. We know that this is going to be a bit of a longer afternoon, so we're going to take a break. Invite everyone to take 5 minutes stretch break, and we will come back and dig into our conversation with some folks who are doing this work on the ground in their communities. All right, thanks all.